Welcome to Teso Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Lee.
Welcome back.
Welcome back, everybody.
We're happy to be here again. As always, we're happy that you've joined us for another conversation.
Thank you for coming back.
Yep, I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika. And this is our podcast, another episode, Why Is This So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance.
Yes.
And in this podcast, what we really try to do is just consider and analyze and discuss those issues that prevent us from being socially just as a society and free. And we also really challenge ourselves to be the change that we want to see.
Right. And we want to challenge you to do the same thing that we're doing. So today our topic, Black teachers matter.
Yes, they do.
Yes. So let me ask you a question, Erika.
Yes, Tonya.
How many Black teachers did you have as a student growing up?
So growing up, so from K to 12, I had 2.
Okay.
I had my 6th grade teacher. She was really important because we were in private school and we were transitioning out of private school into public school. And she was the teacher that I had. And she really helped me with that transition. And I think I took for granted that it would even, at 12 years old, I didn't even know what transition was, but she really helped me. And then I had Miss McAway. She was my 8th grade English teacher. Oh, I had one more teacher. In Willingboro High School, there was a Black History class, and that was Mr. Belford. So I had 3 teachers.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So for me, my kindergarten and first grade teachers were both
Which
Black
I think
women.
is amazing.
It was, because it made me love school.
Yeah.
Like they were the cat's meow. And then I remember, I believe one of my 5th grade teachers was Black. I honestly cannot remember middle school. Just for whatever reason, I just can't remember. I remember a couple of teachers, but they weren't Black teachers. So I don't remember how many Black teachers. I did have, there was one because she was also our youth leader at church.
Okay.
And so, and she was really, she had a really strong personality and a major influence on a lot of the young people. And we had a lot of young people at our church. And then in high school, I had a few. My music teacher was one who was also really instrumental. My choir teacher, but I was also in the band, so the band instructor was not. And then I went to Howard University, so I was inundated with Black professors. But that was really powerful for me as a Black girl coming up in school. Having those teachers, there was something really affirming about that. And of course, it's what inspired me to want to be a teacher too.
Yeah, my 8th grade English teacher, Miss McAway, I loved her. I loved her class. I loved the way she taught. I loved the way she talked. I loved the way she dressed. I just loved her class. And I think it did contribute to me actually becoming a teacher. I think
And an English teacher.
And an English teacher at that. She was just such a wonderful, wonderful educator. She was also our class advisor too, and she had a way of kind of bringing kids together. And Willingboro was at that point, very, very racially diverse, and everybody just loved her. I mean, she came to our 25th high school class reunion, still sharp as ever, Miss McAway. But she had a very, very profound impact on me.
Wow.
And it mattered that she was in front of the classroom. It really mattered.
Yeah. What was interesting was when I was in kindergarten and first grade, I learned this as an adult, and I may have said this in a previous podcast. It was a time in Illinois where they were diversifying the teacher workforce. Now that was back in the 70s. Um, and, here we are,
Yeah.
2023, and a big part of the conversation in education is the same as it was when I
Sure.
was 5 and 6 years old.
Yeah. Which I think is incredible.
I
I
know.
mean, it's been, 20, 30 years, 30 years really, and we're still, trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, it's been more than 30 years, it's been
Longer than
40
30.
years.
No.
Been what, longer?
A little more
Longer?
than
Okay.
40. Not quite
So
50, but
more than
close.
40 years,
Yeah.
we're still trying to figure it out. And I think that just really speaks to, I think there are some strides we're making, but not nearly as much as we should. I think it speaks to just the systemic nature of this challenge that we're having in the way of representation.
Yeah. Well, here's something that's really interesting, that we didn't chat about this when we were prepping for today's podcast, but I remember reading something about some of the unintended consequences of Brown v. Board. And so when students were starting to be bused, when black students were starting to be bused
Yeah.
to white schools, what that ended up meaning in many cases was that there were some schools that the black students attended that were either shut down
Yeah.
or teachers lost their jobs, and the white schools were not hiring black
Yeah.
teachers.
Yeah.
And so, there was a whole wave of, teachers that were displaced, sadly, and unfortunately. And there were a lot of challenges, especially when those black students were bused, to integrate white
Sure.
schools. Those students did not have allies, many of them, in their schools. They were no longer in affirming spaces.
That's right.
And they no longer had teachers who, overarchingly, if you will, cared enough about creating those affirming spaces for students. Not that some, were not good, because obviously there were some that were amazing.
Sure.
Just like, there are plenty of amazing teachers out there who don't look like you and me.
Right.
But, that season in America's history was actually a really challenging season.
Yeah, it was. It was. And there was during that time, when we had scores of, black teaching professionals who lost their jobs, there was no thought given to the fact that these individuals knew the kids, were members of the community.
Knew their
They knew their
families.
families, and now you had kids who were going into spaces where, like you said, there were no allies, and it just made for, we've seen some of the footage, but we've only seen the footage of the kids trying to get into the building. There are accounts of, just the challenges that kids had trying to not only get along with their peers, but also kind of gain the respect of their teachers.
Right, right, right.
And there were challenges academically and socially. And so, had there been a black teacher presence, along with the black students who were being integrated, into these spaces, I think it would have been a different story, certainly, certainly.
And even in those times, white parents, especially some in the South, were not interested in their children being taught
That's
by
right.
black
That's
teachers. And I remember seeing, it was circulating on the internet some time ago, a letter that was written to a black teacher by a school district, back in I want to say the 60s, basically saying that, they would not, their services would not be needed.
Yes,
and that
I think I
they,
saw that.
yeah, I
Yeah.
wish I had a copy of that. But it was indicative of that time, and was, really sad, sad depiction of what was going on in our country as it, related to teachers of color. And here we are in 2023, and there's this push again for teachers of color.
Yeah.
And there's a big piece of there's a reason behind that. So, the research has shown, a lot of things. But first I want to just kind of backtrack a little bit and just talk about the what it looks like. So in our country, 80% of the teaching workforce are white teachers, while 20% are teachers of color.
Yeah.
And not all of those teachers of color are black
That's
teachers, but they are teachers of color. And so our student population is predominantly students of color.
That's right.
So in our country now, more than half of our students are students of color.
Yes.
And so what happens is it creates this cultural mismatch that doesn't have to be a bad thing when teachers have, cultural competence and when they're culturally responsive and sustaining in their practice. But oftentimes there is a cultural mismatch that can be, negative, and that can create challenges for students of color.
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of work with schools around, culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. But, the truth is culture, very often, and we talk a lot about sort of like what is culture, right? And we do some work around cultural reference. And when we talk about culture, we kind of think about, language and food and music and all the things that people tend to enjoy in other cultures. And we think less about sort of the non-visible markers of culture. So our definitions of respect and our thoughts around, role status according to age and gender and those kinds of things. We also, have very different styles of communication. And understanding not only our own cultural reference, but understanding someone else's, and that, what you might think of as, what someone might think of as threatening, might just be a way of an expression of another emotion. It could be joy, it could be sadness, it could be surprise. And so, part of the challenge that we have around, the lack of representation of teachers of color is sort of the lack of the cultural connection. And like you said, the cultural mismatch doesn't have to be a bad thing, but there does have to be, it's not a bad thing when a teacher of another culture says, I'm going to commit to being culturally, responsive and really understanding the cultural backgrounds that my students come from. And I don't think we see enough of that. I don't think we see enough of that.
And representation really matters.
It matters.
And
it matters.
Not just in the classroom, but in the workplace and in every aspect of society. And I remember when I was, when I was a principal, and I remember the little girls, like, wanting to follow me around. And I didn't realize initially what that was about. And then I realized it's representation.
Yes.
Because they hadn't seen anyone that looked like me in this role.
Yes.
And now they know for that this is a possibility for them.
Yes.
It's just like you and I have had conversations about how much we love math and science or technology or whatever when we were children. And I loved it. I loved math. Like when I was a kid, people would say, "What's your favorite subject?" Math. Where it was something that was like really like fun for me. Like I loved, solving problems, and but I never saw any representation in my community in the STEM fields.
No.
I didn't know people who were engineers that looked like me. I didn't even know that was an option. I had no idea.
There were not even black math or science teachers. So I didn't even see it represented in the content in school, let alone, in the larger world.
You're right.
Absolutely.
I didn't have any, I can't think of one.
No black math teachers, no black science teachers.
No.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
And that representation, it does matter. Like I said, I think I patterned myself after Miss McElway in so many ways. And it wasn't even that she was super duper nice, because there were times when she challenged us. I mean, we did not play,
Yeah.
when it came to, but there was I share this a lot about how when we talk about cultural reference, body language is very much cultural, and
Sure.
so is eye control, believe it or not, right? So, well, but so in my home, I could not roll my eyes at my mother, right? My mother
Oh
would say,
no.
"Don't you?"
Oh, I my grandmother took me to the bathroom one time and lit up my
And
behind
you
over
never rolled your
rolling my
eyes
eye.
again,
Not
right?
ever again. It was like,
Yes.
close them. Don't even think about it.
So that's very cultural, because in school with my white teachers, I could do that, and it was very disrespectful, and I knew it, but I knew that they weren't going to say I could not do that with Miss McAway.
Yeah, I
Don't you?
believe that.
And she would say, "Don't you even try." Right? Like in class,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
That matters.
Yeah.
That matters. And so for a teacher to be able to really understand, those cultural reference, kids need that.
They do.
Kids
They
need that,
do.
and they need to see that it's a possibility. I remember when I was teaching, one of the things that particularly my black female students, I taught high school, and I went into, I had taught, I had worked somewhere for 12 years. So when I went into the classroom, I was in my late 30s. And at the time I had gone natural, and there wasn't a whole lot of natural hair. There is now, but
Yes.
at that time, there really wasn't a whole lot of like unprocessed or unpermed or whatever, unrelaxed hair for African American women. My black female students would talk about my hair, and not in a bad way. It's like, how did you do that? Like, well, I just didn't. Well, but how did you get it? And we would talk a lot about hair. I don't know if my hair would do that. And just the conversation, just to be able to talk to an adult about something like hair, to have just a human
Right.
conversation
Right.
about that, it mattered. It
Right.
mattered that they, saw themselves. It mattered that they could say to a teacher, Miss Leek, how when this happens, and then to be able to say to their classmates, what we mean is, like that kind of, that mattered to
It
them. It
did.
mattered
It
that
did.
there was representation in the classroom.
Yeah, you created an affirming space for them.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
that's kind of like how Mrs. Betty Clark, my first grade teacher,
Mm-hmm.
I talk about her all the time. But I loved her. She was my inspiration for wanting to be a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, that representation mattered.
Yes.
Having had her as a teacher really made an impact. So when I started teaching, I started in middle school, and I realized that was not for me. And so then I went down to kindergarten, and although it wasn't first grade, I loved it. And it's like I was channeling Mrs. Clark in the classroom, building those relationships with my students. And I was in a district that was an urban district. And so I really could connect with my kids.
Yeah.
But then when I worked in a suburban district, I still was able to connect with my kids, even though some of those kids didn't look like me.
Yeah.
And, the parents were, I don't know what they thought of me initially, but in the end, they loved me,
Sure.
and for their children to have exposure to a black teacher was really important for them, because as they grow up, so what I found is when I talk to teachers, I remember talking to a group of honored educators in our state several years ago. And the vast majority of them were white teachers who were like the teachers of the year. And they were sharing, I was doing a session with them that was related to educational equity. And they were sharing how they felt cheated as children growing up in the school system because, one, they had very little exposure to anything outside of, they didn't really have a lot of exposure about Black history. They didn't have a lot of exposure to Black people. They had no Black teachers that they could reference. And they often talked about when they went to college, that was their first exposure for some of them
Sure. Yeah.
to diversity. And they felt cheated. So now they're in the classrooms as teachers, but they're obviously doing amazing work in the classrooms, having been recognized as honored educators. But they realized what was missing. And many of them have been really intentional about learning about what they didn't know so they can be more culturally competent in their classrooms. that are growing much more, growing in diversity in ways that they hadn't necessarily seen, in their
I
careers.
think that's the key word, though, that intention. There's a real intentionality
Yeah.
about, being culturally responsive and about learning about just another group's experience and another way to, relate and another kind of cultural background.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. And, I think the other thing that's really important is that, Black teachers matter not just to Black kids,
Yes. Right.
right?
Yes.
Right? Not just to Black kids. Like when kids see a diverse representation of humanity in their lives,
Yes.
it makes them a lot more aware. It makes them a lot more, they can access cultural competence a lot easier because they've been exposed to it.
Right.
It's not a big deal to see a Black, or they don't have a hard time with other, people of other racial backgrounds or cultural backgrounds in charge
Right.
or working with them
Right.
or in their
Right.
communities.
Yep.
It's not that big of a deal, right? Because they've seen it and they've been exposed to it.
Right. But we still have a long way to go. Like
Yeah.
this is still a challenge.
So
Not
why do you
only
think that is, though? Why is it such a challenge?
so, first of all, right now we're in a time and a space where just there's a teacher shortage, period. So that in and of itself is a challenge. Students don't want to go into education.
That's true.
And we see, there's a lot more stressors placed on teachers. That's another conversation that may not necessarily be related to the work that we do, but those stressors are also stressors for Black teachers. So, Black teachers may be in spaces where they are the minority. And they may not have the kind of support that they need.
Sure.
They may be isolated. They may be given the most difficult students, but not being given the support to help them in that process.
Sure.
And in being isolated, so think about like this whole isolation thing. So if you're in a community, and in that community, you don't feel like you belong because you're isolated, because people don't connect with you.
Yes.
They're not building relationships with
Right.
you. That then makes for a really difficult work environment.
It does. It does. And you don't have a voice.
Right.
So
Right.
you don't have, you hear about different teachers who had the agency to, request this for their schedule,
Right.
or this group of kids, or this course. And you hear about it, but you don't have that. You hear about teachers who say, this cannot happen in my classroom, and it's happening in your classroom all the time. And you're like, well, how did they get to decide, their students or their coursework, or when their prep is, how did they get access to these resources? So you don't have a voice. How do they get to decide not to teach this part of the curriculum? And so how does that happen? And it's really sometimes it's the formal, but a lot of times it's the informal. And I can remember, in the department that I stepped into at that time, I was the only African American the only African American English teacher in this district. And there were other new teachers coming in, but because I was like in my late 30s rather than my early 20s, like I wasn't fresh out of college, there was another layer of isolation. And so there were things that were happening in these groups of teachers who were all white, and they were good teachers. It's just that I wasn't really able to access that community until I started to insist on some things. And by then I said, I don't care, because I was non-tenured. I don't care if they let go of me or not, but this is not going to happen. I'm not doing this, or I'm not going to allow this to happen in this area and not in this area. And you think about like you said, you said earlier that teaching happens in isolation. And it does.
We talked about that in a previous
podcast that teaching happens in isolation. And sometimes what happens is teachers actually get the opportunity to represent the district in like these larger kinds of, and the people that get selected to represent the district very often are not the African American teachers, because we are relied on for like discipline. Like,
Yep.
I don't know what to do with this kid. Could you?
With
That happens
yes,
so many
yes,
times
and
with me.
we hear that now
Yes.
with Black
And it's
teachers
so
in spaces where
exhausting.
they are the minority,
Yes.
right? They feel that they don't have support, and then they may also face, and the research is showing that a lot of Black teachers may face racial discrimination.
Yes.
That is what also contributes to that isolation. They may face microaggressions
Yes.
that otherwise might not exist if they were in spaces that were more affirming.
Because saving the kids that we have that have discipline challenges, that the administration or other teachers don't know what to, saving them for the African American teachers is a microaggression.
Yes.
That's a microaggression.
Maybe macro.
Maybe a macroaggression.
Yeah.
Like this assumption, or even if they are really sort of competent in addressing some of the challenges that a kid might have, rather than sort of always funneling the kids to them, why not give them the opportunity to teach their colleagues, right, how to operate in this space where kids are having really good outcomes with them.
Right, which is
Why not
really
do that?
raising the cultural responsiveness of
Yes.
the instructors.
Yes.
And so what happens, Black teachers are not wanting to stay
Right.
in the school system.
That's right.
They don't want to work there
That's right.
anymore.
That's right.
Because they're not feeling supported
That's right.
as they need. They're not feeling like their needs are being met. They're not given the same level of resources or access to
Right.
opportunities for advancement.
That's right.
And it really is, it's a negative situation
Sure.
for them.
Sure.
And so, school districts have a responsibility to, create spaces that are affirming for, Black educators. And what does that mean? Like, when we talk about like what does an affirming space look like? If this is the only Black educator in your district, what does it mean? And what do you think it means to have an affirming space?
Well, first, if you have someone who's the only Black educator in your district, maybe you should get another one. Like maybe you should hire, like try to
Sure.
find, someone else. But I also think, giving that individual a voice. We know that this is not ideal. We know that we need to, increase the diversity in the teaching, workspace. But we also want to make sure that you feel valued, that we value you,
That's the key.
you as,
That's it right
yes,
there.
we value you as an educator.
Right. You're not a token.
You're not a token.
Right.
You are here because we fully recognize your qualifications
Right.
and the value that you bring to the professional community and to the student community
Right.
and to the school community at large. And I
Right.
don't think Black educators hear that very often.
Right. Or not often enough.
And not often
and
enough.
so I mean I was in spaces where as an educator I must say positively that I was affirmed.
Yeah.
Even when I was in the suburban district working as a teacher, my supervisors, they were Black and white, and they were very affirming. They saw the value that I brought to the classroom, and I felt supported. There weren't a lot of us in that school system, but I felt valued, and that made a difference. So for me, feeling valued meant that I could be more confident in my role as a teacher, and that I can, I can create high expectations for my students. I can, have a classroom that's fun and enjoyable, and, all the things that need to happen to create wonderful experiences for students. I was able to do that, and I felt supported in what I did.
And I feel that I was valued, but I had to prove my value. I felt like white teachers that came in, they got the benefit of the doubt. And I felt like I had to prove that I was a good teacher.
Wow.
And it was only after I proved that I was good, not with the Black students, but with the white students and the Hispanic students and the Asians. Once I proved that, then there was value. But it was a heavier lift for me.
Yeah.
And so as we think about the, just retaining and also, attracting Black teachers to the
Understanding
classroom
why they
and
matter.
understanding why they matter. Value is key.
Yes.
Value
Yes.
is
Yeah.
key.
And we challenge you to, think about what is the environment that you're creating for your Black teachers,
Yes. Yeah.
and whether or not you are affirming them and supporting them and, creating an environment where they feel like they belong. That's the key, and it makes it much more attractive
Yeah.
to bring in more Black teachers because we know that Black teachers matter for all
Yes,
kids.
they do. So we invite you to just share with us your experiences in, supporting and valuing your Black teachers in your district, and we look forward to you joining the conversation.
Yeah, thank
So,
you so much for joining us. Again, I'm Tonya.
and I'm Erica. Take
Take
care,
care.
everybody.